Hi everybody, Beth here from Access and Paranormal for this month's I Want to Know, which is all about the Davenport Brothers. A lot of it knowledge is about and sort of the Fox sisters are very well known when it comes to spiritualism and the spiritualist movements, but not a lot of people know about the Davenport Brothers. So I thought it'd be interesting because a couple of people, like with the first I Want to Know that happened with this change of format, I emphasized obviously a lot about what it's like, the best, good parts about research. Hi Rebecca, good to see you, lovely. And by doing so, I think it's important then to actually follow through and say, okay, well, this is a case that I've done some research on, and this is what the benefits for me moving forward as a paranormal investigator is by looking back and seeing other people that have contributed what they have when it comes to the paranormal and what we do now. I know there are a lot of people that are probably thinking, well, there's no real connection between the spiritualist movement and what we do as investigators, but I think there are connections, a lot of, where it's investigating the possibility of an afterlife, and I think that's where it comes from. It's obviously done very, very differently. Technology is a huge thing as a reason why, but I think it's interesting. Like I said, research is very good, but also at the same time seeing how valuable that is when it comes to actually doing your paranormal investigating. Good to see you. So let's get stuck into it. Thank you to everybody that's watching live, and also everybody that will be jumping on, and everybody that's going to be watching the replay as well. I am, of course, living in my lovely abode here, and because it's one of the busiest cities in the world, or the biggest in the world, you'll occasionally hear planes going over and trucks and buses and all sorts of stuff going past. So it isn't quite the same tranquil settings as one had back in Australia, but I am still loving it all the same as well. So enough about that, let's get back to this. So firstly, Davenport Brothers, they were the reason why this case is quite significant is because these guys were known to be the guys that actually created what is known as the spirit cabinet. Now, I've been to a couple of physical mediumship events, and the spirit cabinet is what the physical medium, so normal you and I type person, obviously, clearly, sits in a box, but a box that's made for them in a chair. They are tied to that chair, and they don't come out of that box until the end of the seance or the show as such. With that being the case, back in the day, they were made of wood. These days, ladies and gentlemen, they actually use spray tan tents. So that literally looks like a normal camping tent that you can actually walk and stand in. So they use that more so now than they do. But obviously back in the day when this was happening and the Davenport Brothers had created this, it was a way for them to be able to produce, they felt, with physical and spiritual phenomena without being seen. They had the comfortability, and obviously in pitch black as well. Now, you're probably thinking, if you haven't been to one of these particular events, whether or not, well, how do you know what's going on if you're in the pitch black, you've got no lights whatsoever, and someone's apparently doing something on stage in a box? There is a reason. A lot of mediums believe that light is not good for when you're dealing with this type of work. And also at the same time, the objects that are used can actually be of sound. So back in the day then, I love it, first siren, back in the day now, they actually would use instruments because sound was something, you may not be able to see, but you could actually hear. These days, they use all sorts of objects like glow-in-the-dark type stuff, lights, all that kind of thing, energy that is able to switch on lights and switch off lights, or there's objects on the ground that light up once moved, hence we kind of know that as well, that we use similar things in investigating. This is used from a physical mediumship perspective. Hi, Renata. Good to see you. I can't wait to see you guys. I see them in a few days. It's amazing. I'm so excited. So that's that kind of thing. So they'll use these types of objects and as a way to be able to show and demonstrate that even though they are on stage tied to a chair in a box that they can't get out of, that this particular phenomena is still occurring, and it's through spirit and through ectoplasm and all sorts of different things like that. So that's generally what it is, and these guys were known to have created what is known today as the spirit cabinet. So that's another big thing too. Now the Davenport brothers were two of three They were named, and my apologies, I probably have the wrong pronunciation, but Ira and William Davenport. They were born in 1839 and 1841. And it was just before the spiritualist movement, like the real interest when it came to life after death, actually started to really take off. They were obviously around, and interesting enough, from New York State, where the Fox sisters were as well. So that's an interesting side fact as well, that although they're two very different stories to a degree, they actually came from the same state in America as well. Now, their father was actually a policeman. So when the boys were growing up, he used to go to these particular events and actually thought, why can't I do this at home? Why is there a way I can do this at home? So he's actually started to do that as the boys, I think they were in their early teens originally, and they actually kind of got some really interesting things happening at the time. Now, this continued to happen to the point where even reportedly, and I say reportedly, one of the boys was actually able to levitate, and it was seen by a few people. And when I say a few people, it was estimated up to around 100, possibly more, over that time period, where they would actually come and to these particular seances, and the boys, or one or two of them, at certain times was able to levitate. Now, I find this really, really interesting for a lot of different reasons, apart from the fact that I would love to have seen it. That when people talk about possible demonic possession, that levitation is one of the characteristics. Now, levitation comes to in that light, from that angle, it's considered quite a negative and scary thing to have happen. And yet, it's interesting how when somebody is able to produce it on their own in a setting like that, it seems a lot more socially acceptable. So I just thought it was an interesting side point to make from little bits of research I've done in recent years. So something to keep in mind. Different perspectives, same phenomena. But something that's one's considered quite negative and dangerous, and the other one is something that is considered a demonstration of possible spirit entities. So something to keep in mind. So there's that. So of course, the American Ghost Society actually had claimed that there was a particular spirit entity that they would actually talk to, the Davenport Brothers, and they were actually the spirit that was actually able to help them move objects and do what they were doing in these particular seances. This particular entity, John King, just making sure with my notes, that he was actually able to say to them, I think you need to do this on like a professional level. I think you need to actually go out and perform for people in this way to prove to them that, spirit entities and the afterlife exists. I think this is what you guys need to be doing. So apparently that was something that was told, and that was reported by the American Ghost Society at the time. Now, of course, the kind of things that they were doing were at the time when they first started out, and I think their first show, they were both 14 and 16 around that time, around that age group. It was, they say the traditional stuff, the rappings, the tappings, slight movements, slight tuggings here and there of people sitting around a table. Now, of course, I say, it was only just that. We would love to be able to have that as paranormal investigators, in an individual anyway, regardless. But it's like, it's just the standard. But, back then, that was the standard thing that was happening with a lot of people that were coming forward and saying that they could communicate with the dead. So a lot of it was a more simpler style kind of sort of activity, I guess you could say, that was happening around at the time. But then it actually started to build a fair bit. And it got to the point where in their shows, and that's what they would call them, their shows, it's not to be disrespectful, they would actually have a person sit from the audience that was randomly picked, come and sit in the middle of the stage between the two brothers who were in their spirit cabinets. And at some point in the evening, or in that particular event, that person was thrown off their chair, their coat taken off. This particular guy had a necktie. His necktie was around his leg, and he landed with a tambourine on his head. Now, this is one of the things that would happen. So it wasn't just the propulsion of this person from the chair that was not possible or considered not possible, but also how they landed. So it was so very well orchestrated from wherever it was, whether it was from a person, trickery, or whether it was from spirit. There was a plan in place. So, this was quite extraordinary stuff. I mean, it's extraordinary stuff today, let alone. So their shows became more and more intense. The activity, the things they were able to produce became a lot more complex is the word that I'm wanting to as well say. So of course Reverend JB Ferguson was a massive fan of these guys. Like, these guys are legit, they are on Mekong. What they're doing, I 100% believe. I think these guys are the best. That they're, I stand behind them. I believe that there's spirit coming through these guys and unable to move objects as they do. Now, of course, as they progressed with their shows over time, bit by bit, obviously having different members of the audience come through and actually tie them to chairs and with different knots and different material. Some of the actual really sort of cynical skeptics would actually tie them too tight. Now, apparently there was occasions where they tied them too tight to their chairs, where they would bleed and they'd be bruising. So apparently that's happened a couple of times, from what I could tell. Apologies. But yeah, and also later on there was another show that I think it was in 1865. Around about that time. So they've been running for a couple of years by this point. And in physical medium events, they need to make sure everything's blacked out as much as, like, literally it's the strangest feeling in the world to be in a room and not see, but your eyes are open, like as if they are closed. It's a very strange sensation as a human. So to be in a room for a certain amount of time, I know that the times I've been to a physical mediumship event, they will explicitly say to you, if you feel uncomfortable in these situations, if you are claustrophobic, don't go to them, because it's a very I find that more confronting than any possible phenomenon to even to experience. Like, it is because it's very unnatural for us. It means our fight and flight will kick in, and they just want to make sure you're not going to get up and run off halfway through the show. So with this being the case in this particular situation in 1865, a little bit of the cloth from one of the windows actually dropped a bit. It actually became undone. And a guy called John McCaskill, I may also be pronouncing that incorrectly, so apologies as well, actually apparently witnessed this. And by doing so, he saw enough light come into the event. Now, by doing so and seeing that, just that little glimpse of light, he apparently had seen Ira with one of the instruments in his hand, about to throw it to instigate a possible, this is something of physical mediumship that's occurring. Now, in that moment, John actually realized, I can see what it is and how they're doing it, and basically underpin what work they're doing, and the fact that this is actually something that can be done by anybody, not by somebody who thinks it's spirit coming through. Reportedly later on, he actually worked out how they did all the other tricks that they had performed in that particular event, went along and said, I'm a medium, I'm going to do this, and did a show for himself, got lots of people to come along, and at the end turned around and said, I faked the whole thing, and I did it because I actually know how the Davenport Brothers actually do their show. Now, that's one of the things that happened. But of course, it didn't slow the Davenport Brothers down. Nothing keeps a good medium down in that regard. So it got to the point where, because of that, the Davenport Brothers were starting to get even more picky about how they were tied down, what kind of material they were being tied to their chairs with. It got to the point where they were starting to refuse to perform because of the way in which they were tied down. And riots would occur because people have paid money for this. And they're like, well, come on, I've paid money for this. Now you're not going to perform because you feel like you're being tied down? What the? This is crap. I'm very, very G-rated there. So there's that. Also, they did another show later on in 1865. And they refused to perform because they felt they were tied down by a certain point. So it ended up being where people got really annoyed by this point, and they actually stormed the stage and started to riot. And one of the things would actually happen, sometimes they would smash the cabinets. Like, even, obviously the brothers were out of them, but they were like, this is, like, people were angry, like, I've paid money for this. And there were some people that would actually take parts of the cabinets and actually go and sell them later to make some money, saying, oh, it's a Davenport Brothers spirit cabinet, here you can have it for 2 pennies or whatever it was at the time. So, there's people making money off making money. If somebody else wasn't, then somebody else was. So yeah, there were actually riots and violence because people weren't getting what they were paying for a particular show, which you can kind of understand. Now, again, I'm going to sidestep a little bit from that because there has been a bit of controversy from a well-known medium here in the UK on a particular prominent show that's very well known, who got caught out with information that was fed to him suspiciously without him knowing that it was. And he then obviously sprouted this particular information later on and was told, well, actually, no, that's not correct. That's not historically correct. You were given that information, in a very simple way. I know I speak covertly, and I apologise, but I know it wouldn't take much for a lot of people to be able to work this one out. But then again, it brings back to the point where, people have in these particular shows with the Davenport Brothers, they're refusing to perform, riots break out. There is pressure, regardless of whether there could be something happening or not. This will also be the case with this particular medium, where the pressure to be able to perform, not just in front of an audience, but the TV and on a very well-known program, would have been quite intense. They say that it's spontaneous phenomena. Spirit world ain't going to come whenever you call it, because it's got its own mind and its whole rules and world, and whatever happens out there, that's what a lot of mediums believe. Like it is what it is. You get what you get given. You don't have control over that. So to be able to try and continue with the program, and to be on the ball and go to these historically significant locations and to continually produce information and validate the information from that would be a huge pressure. Now, does it make it right that that person would then make something up? No, of course not. It's the ethics of the particular role, but I could understand the pressure. That's personally for myself. So that's one thing. So keep in mind there as well. Also, another interesting thing about these guys is that in 1876, they actually decided to tour Australia, India and New Zealand. So they got to the point in the UK where it was becoming more and more difficult for them to actually sell tickets, because people were going, I'm not going to turn up. Why should I? These guys aren't going to perform anyway. What's the point? So they ended up taking their show internationally, which also ended up in Australia, which was great because nobody comes to Australia. So it was brilliant. Says she in England. So, of course, by doing so, they had similar situations again happen. Also in Australia, there were riots there as well, because there were shows that they would not perform because they're like, I can't do this. This is too tight, not going ahead. And I think they were starting to use that as a way to then force people to succumb to loosening the ties they had around their waists. But it got their wrists. But it got to the point where that wasn't working anymore, and people were like, well, no, we're not going to succumb to this. This is stupid. When they got to New Zealand, there was one particular show where Ira was like, no, not performing. These are too tight. Again, I'm not going to do anything until I have a doctor come to stage and actually inspect me and make sure that I'm safe and I'm not cutting off circulation. Well, funnily enough, there was a doctor in the audience, and he came up and he had a look and he inspected both of them. And I was like, well, actually, no, you're okay. You're fine. He was able to put 2 fingers above the actual rope that was around the wrist. And he said, I don't see any strangulation or any constriction with your movement, but to be able to not be injured in any way, you're fine to proceed. Even then, I was like, no, not doing it. And William, his brother, said the same thing, and the show didn't go ahead. It got to that point, by that point in time, that it was just becoming too difficult for either of the brothers to actually be able to do shows anymore. And quite significantly, their shows decreased a fair bit, literally to the point when they left. By the time that William and Ira were in New Zealand, William's health was quite bad, and I think the term back in the day is called combustion. He was becoming quite sick, and he went to the doctors in New Zealand, and they turned around and said, look, if you want a particular style of treatment to be able to make sure you're okay, we think you should go back to Australia because it's closer, and they'll be able to help you. But actually wasn't too much longer after they all went back to Australia, where William actually passed away in Sydney, in the York, I think it's the York Hotel in King Street, for those who know Sydney. So there you go, that's a bit of something for the Aussie peeps. So he actually ended up passing away there, and I believe he might be in Rookwood Cemetery. I'm not 100% sure. There's a bit of controversy about that. So he actually passed away in in Australia. And the guy, there was a guy that was also quite, who was kind of like their, and you could, I say secretary, but he was their MC. He kind of helped a lot with the whole events, and said, "Oh, welcome to the Davenport Brothers," that kind of dude, So his name was also William, but his name was William Fay. So when William Davenport passed away, Ira went back to the US, and William Fay stayed, and he lived in regional New South Wales, and then actually moved to Kew in Victoria, for those people who know as well, and stayed there. And another siren, hey, London. So that's how it all eventuated originally for them. Now, because of that, doesn't necessarily mean it all kind of stopped from there, because before Ira passed away originally, he had a good conversation with Harry Houdini. Of course, Harry Houdini being one of the most famous magicians and escape artists. And he said to him, and he believed, he said, "We faked the whole thing. We never said once we were mediums. We just wanted people to turn up to these events and make up their own mind." And he told him all the tricks they did and how they did it. And and it's documented since that Houdini was enormously impressed with the complexity of these events and the effort these guys would go to with regards to their shows. So that's something that was also confessed of later on as well. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle, a lot of people may or may not have heard of him, big fan of the spiritualist movement. Even after hearing from Houdini that the Davenport brothers had faked all their phenomena, he still believed the fact they could actually be legit as well. So that was something also to keep a note. So why would this case be something significant? Why would someone want to research these guys and the type of work they did and the shows that they had and the events that they put on? Again, like I mentioned in the beginning, they were the inventors of the spirit cabinet. That's the first thing. Second thing is the fact that they became so complex with what they did, with the kinds of phenomena that they were able to produce. It was elaborate in those days. It was quite extensive. As I said, it was the beginning. It was levitation. It was all sorts of things: bells, tricks, ropes, all sorts of stuff. Later on, it was also found out they actually had a team of roughly around 10 people in the audience helping them out. So there was another way in which they were able to carry off this incredible experience for people, which is basically what it was. Whether you believed in the afterlife or not, that would have been well impressive. Another thing they also used to do was to rub oil onto their hands, so when they were tied, it was much easier for them to slip out as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So the big thing was the fact that they were really quite talented in being able to get themselves out of their chairs, slip themselves out of their ties, and be able to carry out this particular phenomena, believed to, and then literally in the tightest time possible jump back in and actually be in their chairs for people to then open it up and see that they were right there the whole time. Like, you'd have to be pretty thick and nimble and quite fit to be able to do that kind of stuff. So there was that as well. And of course, there's still to this day a lot of people in the spiritualist movement that do believe these guys were legit with their phenomena. It's going to happen. I think a term that I heard from a lovely person was sometimes there are mediums known as the unsinkable duck. I said duck, which basically means it doesn't matter what they do that could be wrong. They'll always find a way to come back up to the surface and continue some sort of career in something. It may not be the same, but occasionally there are people like that can be the unsinkable duck, where you just, that's a car. You can't, they'll always find a way to bounce back up. And I think with the Davenport brothers, they certainly had a huge influence with the interest in the spiritualist movement. And I guess you could say that's like that. If you could correlate it with paranormal programs these days, we sit there and we love and hate them at the same time. These paranormal shows, but at the same time, although they're not accurate, they're at least showing there's an interest in the possibility of an afterlife. And I think the 1800s version was people like the Davenport brothers, where they would actually start to produce this phenomenon, although they claimed it to be fake afterwards, it fired the interest of, let's go and explore this. I mean, there's the Ghost Club that I'm a part of, there's the Society of Psychical Research, which of course I'm also part of, that have been around for like 120, 130 years, because it's spawned from people who, this interest, this spiritualist movement interest, where people are claiming to be able to talk to the dead, and these societies were created because people were like, well, really? Because let's look at this a little better and see if we can find and understand what's actually going on here. And if there is something happening from an afterlife perspective, then what can we learn from that? So thank you, Rebecca. So yeah, it's I think dare I say, paranormal TV programs and spiritualist movement can also be the same. It's a love-hate thing. You can love it and hate it. There were a lot of people that weren't legit, and there are people who still believe that others were. Maybe they were. I wasn't around in the 1800s, unless you believe in reincarnation. But I would love to have seen and been around at that time as well, because methods were a lot more simpler back then. And I think having a sort of a futuristic mind would have been really fascinating to have witnessed any of this kind of stuff happening. So yeah, they definitely contributed a lot to the spiritualist movement when it came to people in that time period, and they were very elaborate with what they actually did as well. So I hope everyone has food for thought for this. Again, use the comment section down below. Again, I always love knowing your thoughts on it. Do you think they may be legit? Do you think it was a bit of a smear campaign from Houdini going, oh, I spoke to him? And go and do your research, have a look and see. I think it's important to look at the people that were there to create. Apparently they had said they had done this fraudulently, to be able to gain interest, but it gained interest, and it kept the interest going. And obviously long after they passed, there is still an interest, quite maybe not the same way, in a different way, but they were fine contributors. And there are many different mediums, or people that claim to be mediums, physical mediums, in and around that time. Mina Conan was another one as well. All sorts of different types of mediums. There's not just them and the Fox sisters. There were quite a few around that time, because of course, people were interested in it. They wanted to know. Are these people legit, and go along to it. So literally, it is almost like, in some way, and I probably will be shot for saying this sometime in the future, paranormal TV program scenario. We hate it, we love it, but it's giving an interest out there, whether we believe that the phenomena is real, or it's been made up, or there's a storyline or not. It gives people the possibility. It makes them think. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. So I do hope everybody's having a great evening. I'm going to chime out now. I hope wherever you are in the world, it's going to be a spooky week in a good way, and you've got lots of wonderful things happening coming up on this weekend too. Do take care, but again, use the comment section down below. Let me know your thoughts on this as well, and if there's any other cases that you have come across where it's come to the spiritualist movement, not just the Fox sisters or somebody else. There are other cases. I'd love to know. Mind is like a parachute, works better when it's open. So let me know. Tag me in the comment section. And I do hope everyone's going to have a wonderful, wonderful day, evening, and morning, wherever you are in the world. Take care, and thank you so much for watching.